we go look at the games, and it was early on that when we saw up on the screen, they had fighters fighting fast as hell. We said, holy shit, okay, this thing is great. And what was a 6-month production time to fill a hole in the factory, we threw that out the window and realized, continue where you're going because this thing is great.
It's just in obnoxious mode.
Hi, this is Ralph Klisiewicz on Creativity, episode number 7. I'm here with Josh Tsui, a developer of video games and much more, right?
Yeah, that's all over the map, I should say.
Well, tell me how you got into the business of making video games.
You know, it was, in many ways, like many people, a bit by accident. I went to study film in college, and around my senior year, that's when computer graphics became more accessible. And I particularly enjoyed the practice of digitizing film or video and getting them into the computer to manipulate. So I learned how to do that, and after graduating, a company here in Chicago by the name of Midway Games had just released the first Mortal Kombat game, and they had mastered the art of getting actors into video games. You know, as opposed to drawn sprites and drawn characters, they use actual actors, they videotaped them, got them in.
I think you mentioned that in your documentary, that the narrative of the video game has to be bigger than the video game itself. There's got to be a story that attracts a player too.
I think now more than ever, the similarities between filmmaking and films and games are more and more alike. Back when I started, arcade games are very short form in nature, and so there wasn't time to develop large narratives or large stories. You know, you wanted people to play a game, you know, or sink a quarter every 45 seconds. And so a very small room for there to be stories, but a lot of the work behind the scenes leading up to the game involves a lot of storytelling. You want to have characters that have a backstory, you want some depth to it, you want some overall story arc to it. So ultimately you have that background, so when you create the game itself, it feels like a lived-in world that a player is getting into. Even if they're not being told an entirely long story, they're feeling it in their characters.
I watched your documentary, Insert Coin.
Yeah.
And what really interests me is the camaraderie of the people, the creative minds, that some were very competitive, some were very friendly, right? But it was the environment that fostered creativity. That decade produce some exceptional video games, given the limitation of the technology itself, right? You want to maybe talk about creativity and the camaraderie of these creative human beings working together?
It was like a motley crew of people, of all different experiences. Yeah, you know, so you have people who are, you know, programmers, like hardcore programmers. And then you have somebody who's a comic book artist and who, you know, loves science fiction. You have someone like me that comes from a film background that just wanted to tinker around with computer graphics and stuff. We all kind of came in our respective roles, but we also, you know, the teams are so small. And that's one of the things I really loved about that era, was like the games were large, but the teams were small. And so everybody counted. And so we all had our roles, like I was doing artwork and such. But at the same time, I was a part of the overall game design and the gameplay, you know, working with the programmer and things like that, brought in my own personality, my own background on things. So, you know, my first game I worked on was a wrestling game, you know, and so I put in some of my humor and things, and everyone put their personality in. After the success of Mortal Kombat, there were a bunch of other fighting games that came out, And they thought that the reason why Mortal Kombat was successful was because of the excessive violence, okay? But that wasn't true. So they all got it wrong. So they all made games that were crazy violent. Oh, we're just gonna have people decapitated and this and that and stuff. And just, it almost felt very random. But the difference was that the games we made, whether it was a wrestling game or Mortal Kombat, things like that, was we put our personality in there, which meant a lot of humor. And a lot of humor referencing other mediums, movies, comic books, and things like that. So there was a certain depth to them. It was the camaraderie that came from very difficult working conditions that made us more creative. So a lot of times I talk about how important restrictions were. So, back then we had very low budgets. Our working conditions were in the back of a manufacturing factory that they just put together a studio out of just a random space. And then on top of that, the technology, there was no technology. We had to make the technology as we're going along. And so all of these restrictions that we had in front of us made us kind of push each other, push ourselves, but also push each other. And that's where some of the competitiveness comes in. We all want to show off what we can do with the least amount of assets or least amount of resources.
But tell me this, if this is not true. Often when I had limitations and a problem that I had to solve, the solution to the problem was much better than original plan.
Absolutely.
Have you ever run into that kind of case?
Absolutely.
Do you want to give us an example?
Yeah, I mean, holy smokes. Almost every project has an example of that. I would say that, one of a great challenge that we had was later on, I had my own game development company called Robomoto, and we were working with Activision on a Tony Hawk skateboarding game. And at the time, they basically came to us and said, this is during the Guitar Hero era. So everybody was playing with peripherals. And so they asked us, hey, we want you to make a game where a player stands on an actual skateboard to control the characters on screen. The restriction was it had to cost under a certain amount of money, but it had to still work. And so it was one of those things where because we had that restriction, we had to be very careful about what kind of equipment we put in there, what kind of sensors we put in there, they're called gyroscopes, all of these things that to try to detect motion on a board. And ultimately what happened was that we came up with a very great solution. They came back saying, this is way too expensive. We had to keep whittling it down, but that forced us to learn how to manipulate software to work on limited hardware to make something work out.
You came up with a solution nobody thought of because you were forced to come up with a cheaper solution, and that solution is better than perhaps potentially what other people came up with, right?
Exactly, because it's there. If we had it our way, it would have been a controller that would have cost $500 for the ultimate controller. But the thing is, nobody would ever buy it. Right. And so by the time we figured it out, it's like, yes, after a year of research, all these different types of hardware, we figured it out, and now we have the math involved, the math in the software involved, that we could apply this to so many different controllers just based off of very small bits of hardware.
So this experimentation, this loop, learning, experimenting, hence transferable skills, right?
Exactly.
Tools for other potential video games.
Exactly.
Maybe that leads you to, hey, maybe we can do somebody stands on the same board and do a spaceship
Exactly.
video game, right? And so on. So yeah, let's segue to that, because would you agree that creativity, you need some sloppiness in creativity? And I think you referred to that. There was reference in your film, Insert Coin, how people would say, well, do whatever you want, see what you come up with. And probably some of the things didn't work, but you needed that sloppy sort of experimentation, would you say?
Yeah, definitely to start with, you need to have that blue sky type of attitude and such that may not make sense, let's say economically, or may not make sense schedule-wise, but you have to go through that. And it's almost like stages of grief. You go through this big idea, and then you start realizing, oh, we can't do our dreams. We need to keep funneling it down to the essential of what's really important. Especially in the arcade era, it came down to you have a very small budget. Back then, video game arcade machines did not have hard drives. They were all chips. They were all RAM. So you had the restriction of how much storage you have. So that was another. So all of these things forced us to think more efficiently, smaller. What's the best way we can push the hardware and the software as much as possible, and that that created a lot of creativity.
I don't know where you see the future of the video games, but feels like film and video games, they blend a lot more these days. I've had the experience when I think the first time I started playing Halo.
Right.
Me and my friend, we took us, I think, about my roommate back then. Me and my roommate back then took us about, I think, 3 months to pass the entire Halo at a certain level, right?
Yeah.
But it was an adventure. It's like, it's an interactive film,
Yep.
right? You go to completely different environments. It's quite an adventure.
Storytelling is storytelling, no matter what medium it's in and such. I think the big difference with games, obviously, is that you're not necessarily completely in control of the player, or in the case of a film, the viewer and such. So trying to, take into account all the possible things that can happen, but yet still push the narrative forward is an incredible challenge. Yeah. There are what are called narrative designers who work in games, and that's their whole job is how do we tell the story, give the player the sense of autonomy or agency to be able to explore a world, do what they want to do.
You might go left or right or go back, or make a choice that you could not have predicted.
Right.
I'll give you an example of that. One of the games, this is way early, before I think Mortal Kombat, I used to have a Commodore 64,
right, sure.
where you had like this tape deck and you had like cassettes, you put it in and load it in, go get yourself some soda, come back, and that game is loaded in. So it was the soccer game, right? I used to play the soccer game. And I think the designers were somewhat limited, right? And they made the game, it was a World Cup game. It was very, very difficult. But I realized I found like this a loophole where the best way to score, if you took your winger all the way to the corner and you threw this crazy cross back to outside penalty box, and then 9 out of times you could score with a bicycle kick. That stuff never happens in a soccer. So whoever designed it thought, well, nobody's going to do that.
Yeah.
And there was a loop. It's like, oh my God, I can beat Brazil now. I'm playing with Poland and I'm beating Brazil 6-1.
Yeah, it's amazing when you work on a game and it goes through months and months of bug testing and QA and all these other thinking, okay, we found everything, and you put the game out, and within a day, somebody finds a bug that exploits the game. In the arcade days, we used to make a game. Before it was done, we would take it to an arcade or bowling alley and test it. And we would like kind of hide in the back and just watch how people react. And I guarantee you, every single game that I've worked on during that era, within a half hour, somebody would find a bug that would crash the entire game. And we're like,
with 1 quarter, beat the entire game.
And it's like, how did this happen? All this testing, and
that speaks to human creativity, see? Because you can design mathematically all the possibilities. Like I said, those designers of that soccer game, they never thought somebody would do that, right? But I think that's the beauty of human creativity. It's sloppy, unpredictable. And then would you say, and I would go further with that playing games, in this case video games, really fosters creativity itself, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Just, when you're playing the game as is and you're free roaming and you're doing your thing, you're just the sheer traveling around in a video game is creativity. We used to design the games with these, what we call Easter eggs in the games, hidden little secrets. Because once we discovered that players really delighted in finding things, outside of the norm, then we started hiding things in there. We started hiding little button press combinations, so little things would pop up here and there, and people just love that. So they love playing the games, but if they think that there's something secretive in there, it just makes the experience so much larger for them. They think that there's a secret world down there. The Pleasure Dome.
The Pleasure Dome.
Yes.
So you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so the infamous Pleasure Dome in Smash TV, was a quote-unquote secret room that if you did certain combination of things in the Smash TV game, at the end of it, you would get this promised Pleasure Dome where, it's like paradise and things like that. And this was spelled out in the beginning of the game, so people will start playing it. And the game designer put that in there, never thinking that anybody would ever get to the end of the game. again, back then, arcade games were really hard. You put a quarter in, you play for 30 to 45 seconds, and you keep having to put quarters in. So he didn't think anybody would get to the end. But ultimately, people did get to the end and found out that it didn't exist. So word gets out about this happening, and the distributors of the arcade games contact Midway Games saying, what the hell is going on with this and such? And so he ultimately had to put in that secret level back into the game again, which created a whole other round of players discovering it and making even more money because of it. But that was really one of the early examples of just, letting people in on a secret or feel like they're being in on a secret and such, just to kind of get them excited.
I'm quite interested in the process of designing NPC, and how do you approach that when you design NPC against a creative human being? And potentially, I'm sure you can define NPC better than I do.
Yeah. So non-playable characters, that's a technology that has really evolved a lot over the years and such. When you have something like a fighting game, let's say, your opponent is a non-playable character, obviously, and so they're programmed to know what moves you're going to do, or try to predict what moves you're going to do, and then try to counter that move, or try to attack you, trying to predict if you're going to block a certain way and things like that. So it's very simple. It's not like it's not like the type of AI that we have now, but it is a form of AI back in the day. And then as you get into other game genres and over time, these non-playable characters start to get more and more sophisticated, but they're not completely autonomous. They're not, thinking on their own and such. So a lot of it has to do with, when you as a player interact with them, those non-playable characters have a choice of reactions of how they're going to react to you, a choice of different types of actions and things. If you really think about it, things that are non-playable, let's not talk about just non-playable characters, but things that are non-playable just in the game itself, such as the environment, animations, a lot of the interactions that are going on and there are affecting you as a player. So when people say that these are non-playable, that doesn't mean that they're not affecting how you play or how you should be responding to things. But now, at this point, it's a certain percentage of your gameplay is reacting to them, and how is that going to grow from there?
You're right. There are certain components. It's not just your opponent. For example, like a shooting game. I played a lot of Halo. Yeah. You figure out that if I jump on this rock and I shoot a rocket while jumping, it's more effective than standing on the ground because I can more angle my rocket down onto the ground, for example, right? And create more damage. Now, the NPCs, these non-playable characters, they don't learn from that, right? They don't see, this guy has came up with a different strategy. Should we learn and change our strategy, right? That's not in a program, at least in that game.
Not yet. That's the thing. So then that's what really is going to be interesting to see how deep does that interaction go. Like I said before, in traditional non-playable character or non-playable element type of AI, it's they're kind of fixed on what they can do, and they are kind of learning based off of what you're doing, but not to a deep level.
In shooter games, like me and my friend, we play together cooperatively to beat the NPCs to advance to the next level. But then I think the shooters, there is much greater appetite to play against other human beings.
Right.
And there's got to be a reason for that because the human beings are creative and they come up with different solutions.
Sure.
And now you even have EA Sports, right? EA Sports.
Yep.
And it's almost like playing basketball. You're just using a different media, right? So I think there's more fun to play against other creative beings. So I think the question was, at some point, would then AI become as creative as we?
I think it can be. I think the issue may be that no matter how good the AI is, if you know you're playing against AI, there's a feeling that you're being cheated. Yeah. So I likened it to if you're eating something that's artificially flavored, if you know that it's artificially flavored, you're in the back of your mind, it can taste exactly like a real strawberry, let's say. But if you kind of know that it's not real, then it doesn't feel quite right. I think it's one of those technologies where, yes, you can put it in there, but is it really adding to the experience?
I get it. Yeah.
And there
it
are
does not feel human.
Right. And-
Because I think, tell me if I'm wrong about this, but the more I learn about AI, the more I realize it's not really thinking or really solving problems creatively. It's solving mathematically. Everything boils down to mathematics,
Right.
algorithms, and potentially everything going towards the mean, right? It looks at distribution of data and then figures out what's the mean of the best solution, right?
Right, and I think it just comes down to where in the process is it being used, where should it not be used, and it's just being more smart about it. And I'm excited by the technology overall, but I know that based off of experience with previous technological waves that we've gone through is there's all this craziness where everyone thinks it's going to be everywhere, but then practicality-wise, it starts whittling it down to, okay, this is really where it belongs for this industry. This is where it belongs for that industry, and then things work its way out and such. But we're just not quite there yet.
For example, in film, you can use AI for VFX. Like for example, here we got the green screen, right? I want to put that's going to be a window, and behind it we have a Manhattan, street on Manhattan somewhere. Sure, we can do that, probably generate it with AI. But would I want to see, I just prompt what Josh is going to tell me. He send me an email, just put an avatar here, and I'm going to talk to a block of green space. And he just prompted me, he sent me an email, and I would just put it in there, right? That would not work.
Right, exactly.
It's a little subtlety because we're always reacting differently. If you're going to say something to me that excites me, I might even change my posture.
Yeah.
And vice versa. I might ask you something that might challenge, and then you might get maybe slow down your pace. And all these little idiosyncrasies are very important in performance of an actor. And I'm sure going forward with video games too, right? That the AI is not going to replace both human beings that we can play against, right? Two, it's not going to replace game designers, right?
Exactly.
Because you can't just say, well, he'll give you some prompts and build me the best video game you can possibly do.
Right, exactly. There's, people will play against NPCs because if they have nobody else to play with online or their friends aren't, they'll play it, but they know it's an NPC and they don't have a problem with it and such. But they would much rather play with their friends because they have a history with each other.
And there's always something different. Well, with Halo, for example, I kind of stopped playing video games at Halo and then kind of don't play that much anymore. But I remember, when you play against NPC, there's this adventures and you explore this world. So you're kind of participating in this film. And there's some sort of limitations because say you open the door and these three guys are going to come out, they killed you. Okay, all right, so I'm going to talk to my buddy. The next time you go from left, or from right, I'm going from left. We're going to surround the same three guys. We know how we're going to come out. They probably have an algorithm to come out 2 or 3 different ways, right?
Exactly.
And we pass it, and we have fun because then past the door, there's something else we can experience.
Right.
But then the whole experience of entering a world with 12 different players online, I remember that Halo, I think, introduced the first time playing online against other players. Then it becomes a sport. It becomes, and it's ongoing learning, creative learning of creatively figuring out solutions.
Right.
Halo, I'll tell you this story because one of my roommates, he was excellent at Halo. He was so good that he would go online and people tried to recruit him for teams before they had teams. Then he got sidetracked with medical school and became a
pesky medical
surgeon.
school.
But the interesting is he was very good, much better than me. But I figured this one strategy that just drove him insane. So he was much better with all the weapons, laser, sniper rifle, shotgun, everything. So I came up with the solution. I would just run away from him, get in the hallway, and I would just drop grenades behind me. And he would just eventually run into those grenades and blow up. And the NPC would not come up with that strategy, right? And it drove him insane. And he then had to change the strategy against me.
Yeah.
He could beat a lot of different people, but I just found this one little loophole.
No.
Right?
Yeah, that's I think people really underestimate how, the history between people and the sense of community is really what a lot of these games are about and such. And so whatever NPCs or AI you put in there won't replace that. It can supplement it and such, it can enhance it, but it won't replace that.
And going further about creativity and playing games, you can have the same platform. Like you could probably recycle the Halo game from the late 90s, and people still can come up with different strategy, have fun with it, right?
Yep, exactly.
Just like a basketball. You
Exactly.
can play 2 players, and you're not 6'8", so you can't dunk the ball. You figure out a way to score, right?
Exactly.
So you can always have creative fun with it and exercise your creativity in
Yes.
itself as a human being, right? So when we talk about AI, we know that AI is going to get bigger and better and faster, potentially work with a lot more data. When we talk about non-playable characters, do you feel like at some point that maybe the tables will turn, that AI is going to have so much control that potentially can nudge us, human beings, to behave according to its algorithms?
Hard to predict, but I think being led astray down a path by AI, I can see that being fun. I mean, it's if you think about a ride at Disney World, you're completely controlled by something beyond yourself. You're there for the ride, and you're just gonna go experience things and such. I still think that there will be elements of design behind it where the AI is still in guardrails, because like I was talking about before, it can't. If it's just massive free roaming and it's just too random, nobody's going to enjoy that. So there is still design involved with it and such. But in terms of, that's something that I can see where people who are less technically minded can design experiences like that, because now you're basically allowing AI to do a lot of the work for you. And now it becomes less tech-minded and more design-minded. I guess that's the best way of saying it.
Right, so the creativity is left for the human beings, and the AI potentially would just resolve some more of the technical problems.
Exactly.
So it becomes. So I think the way you see at least AI is that it's going to essentially become more of a practical tool, not something that will replace.
Yeah, I mean something, and this kind of gets to an area that is really, is interesting for me, is this idea of accessibility, the ability to allow people to create things that used to be very technically difficult to do, or even just getting access to that type of technology. And so the optimistic side of me is that when AI gets to a point where people who have amazing concepts, but they just can't get it out of their heads and into reality, can use AI to assist them to get that going, I think that's going to be very powerful. Back in the early days of video game development, you'll notice that the types of people who made video games back then were all coming from computer science. And so games back then had a very specific personality to them that was just they're almost like endurance tests more than games. And then as the technology became more and more accessible, where other people were able to make games, like people that were more storytellers or more designers, that's when you saw games really expand out and be more story-driven and be deeper experiences. And so, so as we go, dive into the future and we see how AI can assist on the technical end of things, I think there's going to be a wave of people who are making, and not just, I'm just talking about games, and it can be film, can be anything. You'll get people who are going to be able to unleash their creativity because they're not hurdled by technology so much.
I agree with you. For practical reasons, AI can be effective, but when I think people feel threatened and you can keep hearing this theme that, especially from 4 or 5 biggest companies in US who are trying to chase this holy grail of general AI that's going to be able to do everything.
Sure.
And it becomes a race, not because if this is achieved, it's going to be something spectacular, but I don't want to miss out. I want to make sure that guy doesn't get it before me, so I have to chase that. But in reality, I think if, hypothetically speaking, if you do create AI that can, replace you, replace me, replace everybody, then everything that once had value becomes worthless. Right? What's the point? You can prompt, make video games that nobody wants to play, or you can prompt a bunch of films, or you actually destroy an economy, and by doing so, also can destroy culture.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, but to your point, you just said you can make a game that nobody wants to play. If nobody wants to play it, then it just dies, and such. So I think the fact that somebody can make something doesn't mean that it's going to be good, and doesn't mean it's going to last and make any type of impact. And so, a lot. If you look back at just fairly recent history, when YouTube came around, technically anybody can upload things to YouTube. There's millions of YouTube videos that go up every single day and such. But, 99.9% of them just die on the vine. And the content, or I hate the word content, but the videos that are good stand up to the test of time. I just remember when YouTube came out, people were watching cat videos and things like that. But look how much YouTube has evolved. Since
you can learn everything on YouTube.
You can learn everything on YouTube. When I was working on Insert Coin, I had never edited a feature-length documentary before, and I just used YouTube to learn how to do that. And how incredibly useful that is, and people would have never predicted that 15 years ago.
I think one problem that I see with our current culture is they're always chasing efficiency and productivity. But in doing so, I think we might lose our humanity. Do you have an opinion on that?
Oh yeah, I agree. I think efficiency and productivity are important, but I agree in that if that's all you're chasing after and you're not going through the friction of the grind of going through, especially in creative projects, going through the grueling time of, let's say, just writing and writing bad stuff, or shooting bad stuff and things like that, it's definitely harmful, and I think it's paralyzing when you think too much about efficiency. I think being personally sloppy about things and iterating and making the time to iterate on things is totally crucial.
And it's crucial to growth.
Exactly.
Right? You got to make mistakes. You got to be like a child. You got to play and do pointless things 90% of the time, first few years of your life, so then you can figure out what works and what doesn't. Because our world is always changing, and as human beings, we always have to adapt to it.
Yeah, I do think that people who are creative or make creative products understand that. They understand efficiency up to a certain point, but you have to just go through the process. I think the people who are really, just so always thinking about efficiency and productivity are people who don't necessarily make things.
Exactly. It's not always about what's the best, efficient, optimal way to either design a game, write a book, or create a film. Sometimes I want to do something very specific, and that speaks to me, and hopefully speaks to other people. And if it doesn't, maybe so be it, right?
Yeah, I agree. Totally agree.
And then you get, very creative people like filmmakers like Wes Anderson.
Right.
Not everyone likes it. Like my brother watched it and said, I don't get it. They're just quirky, goofy characters. And I was like, yeah, but they're perfectly symmetrical and they move in such a predictable way, but that's his style. And I'm sure he was told a number of times, like, dude, just loosen them up a little bit. Or, no.
It's just this thing, and then people got used to it.
Yeah, and he's got a following it. And
exactly.
Now it's a thing, right? It's a creative style.
Right, exactly.
Tell me a little bit more about filmmaking and the documentary that you made, and specifically the risk of doing a documentary, because you don't know which direction it's going to go.
Right. Yeah, it was, I felt like I went through grad school by making the documentary, because I studied film in college, and then I got into games, and 25 plus years passed by, and I realized I need to get this film bug out of my head. So that's what inspired me to make the film. And so, luckily for me, I knew the subject really well, just because I had worked at the company that I was profiling and such, and I had great access to people. So that made have to work very easy, because I already knew the story structure for the most point, and I knew all the people. So interviewing them was very easy, and I felt like that really helped, keep the energy going. I think, what was really surprising to me was, again, being a first-time documentary filmmaker, is realizing that all the storytelling is in the edit, is in the post-production. Yeah. And so I didn't realize how long it was going to be to edit this, to get it to a form that I was really, really happy with and such. And I got really lucky in terms of the archival materials and such. So, so that all kind of came together. But it was one of those things where a lot of planets aligned to help make that happen.
You're right, especially in post-production on a documentary, you have to be a lot more creative, because if you're making a narrative film, you might have a storyboard and script. Right. And in the edit, you can deviate. I'm going to make this scene shorter. I'm going to cut this out, and so on and so on. But you can't reinvent scenes. You don't have the footage.
Right, exactly.
But in the documentary, people tell you something completely different, and you just say, let me ask you 2 or 3 more questions, and maybe I need to shoot some more B-roll for that, and so on and so on. And you just accumulate all that stuff. And you don't know exactly how the story starts, begins, or continues.
Yeah. At the end of the day, the overall theme that carried over through the entire film was not something that I had predicted would happen. It happened after I had done many, many interviews. I started seeing certain themes come up, and I thought, okay, I need to make a note of this. And so even though I knew the story of that decade of games, I didn't realize how one game influenced another, how this person who had nothing to do with this game actually affected this game, and just all that interplay in between all of these different people and the games involved was something that came out of the edit, came in much later on. And one of the most, two of the most crucial interviews that helped solidify the story didn't come until the last interview. They were literally at the end of production. And when those interviews happened, that's when I realized, okay, I think I got the story finally.
In your film, what is highlighted is that playing arcades in the 90s was a very communal experience. Now we move to consoles, but now I guess the communal experience is on the internet and people playing against each other.
Right.
Where do you see the future of the games? Do you see it evolving in a different direction, maybe creating different communities and a different complete communal experience?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think there's going to be a revolutionary change, as in something new is going to happen. All of a sudden, everybody is just playing in the same place. I think, people have found their communities, whether they're in person or online, playing against each other. I think that there's going to be technology that's going to make people feel more present with each other. Instead of, right now, people who play online, they have their headsets, they're in front of their, screens and such. I can see, I don't know what that technology is, but I can see, something happening where people can really feel like they're right next to that person. And I'm not talking about VR or anything like that, but I just think that there's just going to be something that's going to give more presence to each other. But at the same time, I do think that people forget that people actually go to these family fun centers to play games in real life. And the arcades have evolved and they've gotten bigger in some ways. They just changed a bit. They're more family oriented. They're almost like mini casinos for kids at this point, which is really unusual. But those keep getting bigger and bigger. And then you're seeing these indoor almost amusement parks that are happening all over the place. So again, these are more extensions of what are currently there. But yeah, I do feel that with Gen Z and Gen Alpha, there's a real desire to be out of the house. This kind of goes back to playing against NPCs and things like that. That's never going to go away, obviously, in things. But again, that people can sense that human interaction and how much they long for that. When somebody is at home and they have a quick moment to play a game, they want that human connection. I think we always will. I don't think that's going to go away,
right,
no matter what. And so how that communal experience is given, is going to change over time and things. But I think people always want to be around other humans or interact with other humans.
Human communication and building communities is crucial to being human.
Yeah.
And to be creative.
Exactly. Look at Roblox. Roblox is such a massive thing. When people were talking about the metaverse, I mean, it was already there. Roblox is basically that, or Fortnite, and people use that not just to play games. They're there to hang out with each other. They're there to message each other, talk with each other, and things like that. The older generation, from my generation and such, they think, oh, they're just playing games. No, they're not playing games. They are literally in there talking with each other, and as if they're in a regular playground. We're just not used to that.